moments so that we're not interrupted. Organizing a speaking event like this takes a lot of work, and I would like to especially thank Liz Cavasek and the Career and Employment Resources Division for their assistance. In addition, I would like to thank my department head, Marilyn Terrell, Dean Scott, as well as the WATEC administration for their support of this type of educational opportunity. With education, our school has speakers that represent multiple views. Today's speaker, Dr. Tom DiLorenzo, is here to talk about socialism versus capitalism. If you enjoy this talk and would like to learn more about capitalism in action, please consider attending one of the panel discussions, which is next door, that's being held at 12:30 as well as 2 p.m. So a little bit about Dr. DiLorenzo. Thomas DiLorenzo is a professor of economics at Loyola University, Maryland, and a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. Dr. DiLorenzo is an author or co-author of 15 books, including The Problem with Socialism, How Capitalism Saved America, The Untold History of Our Country from Pilgrims to Present. He also published dozens of articles in academic journals, including the American Economic Review, International Review of Law and Economics, and many, many more. Dr. DiLorenzo is widely published in newspapers and magazines. He has appeared on hundreds of radio talk shows and on CNN, C-SPAN, Book TV, PBS, the History Channel, and Fox News Channel. He is a columnist and a blogger for LouRockwell.com. My hope is that Dr. DiLorenzo will challenge some of your preconceived notions about the way the world works. The cognitive dissonance that hopefully you experience means that you're thinking critically. Critical thinking is one of our core values here at Lake Tech. Now, there will be a question and answer period after Dr. DiLorenzo talks, so I request respectfully, please do not interrupt him during his talk. We just wait until the end. And without further ado, please welcome me in joining Dr. DiLorenzo.
Is it off? Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kelly. Thanks for inviting me. How's the volume? Sounds loud to me. Maybe. Okay. Anyway, yeah. I've written 2 books that are just perfect, I guess, for this lecture. Capitalism and Socialism, as Kelly mentioned. This one, How Capitalism Saved America, is sort of a history of American capitalism. And last July, I published another book called The Problem with Socialism. It looks like this. It's Pinocchio on the front cover. We debated whether it should be the Pied Piper or Pinocchio, but it's written in a very, very readable way. There's a big literature in economics, my field, on socialism, and a lot of it is too academic, hard to understand. But so that was my goal with this book, was to summarize a lot of this literature in a way that a reasonably educated high school student can understand. And so I'm going to try to, and what motivated me to write that book, and what my publisher, Regnery Publishing, contacted me about it, was there were these surveys. One survey said that 60% of voters under the age of 30, said they could vote for a socialist for president. And those of us who are my age were kind of very surprised by this, because we lived through the worldwide collapse of socialism in the late 1980s and the early 1990s all over the world. And so it got us wondering, well, how could all these young people think this? And I think the main reason is they don't really know what it is. And they certainly don't know much of the history of it. And so what I'm going to try to do in about 45 minutes is explain some of the meaning of what I call real capitalism, and contrast that to crony capitalism, because I think there's a lot of confusion over that. Even Bernie Sanders is confused about that. I'm all with him when he criticizes the one percenters who made big boatloads of money through political connections and special favors from government. That's called crony capitalism. But where he's wrong is that the entrepreneurs who made a lot of money by producing great new products, cheaper products, employing hundreds of thousands of people, there's nothing wrong with that. That's real capitalism. And so that's one of the things I hope to explain. So I want to talk about what is capitalism. Then I want to explain briefly what crony capitalism is, which is different. And then the problem with socialism, or what socialism is, and why you do not want that as part of your future as young students. And as a definition of capitalism, there's a couple of short, terse definitions of capitalism that I kind of like. I put in my capitalism book. One's by the economist Murray Rothbard. He says, this is what free market capitalism is: a network of free and voluntary exchanges in which producers work, produce, and exchange their products for the products of others through prices voluntarily arrived at. That's it. That's what capitalism is. It's not this demonic thing. Adam Smith, there's a famous book in economics that was written in 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence. It's called, known as The Wealth of Nations. It's an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And there's one line in there that describes what capitalism is, where Adam Smith said, "Give me that which I want, and I will give you that which you want." That is, if you're in business, how do you make a lot of money in business? By pleasing people. That's how you make a lot of money in business. And a lot of my students are big fans. I was teaching a business school, big fans of the television show Shark Tank. How many of you watch Shark Tank? Probably young people especially seem interested in this. Well, I watch it all the time. It's one of my favorite shows, along with all the animal shows. I watch mostly the Shark Tank, which is kind of an animal show, Shark Tank, and the Animal Planet stuff. But if you pay attention, what every one of these people do, they go in front of this board of billionaires, and they make a pitch to finance their new business or their new idea. And every one of them is something that they think will improve the lives of their fellow human beings in some way, enough that they will pay for them. I think that they say the most profitable product ever funded by these Shark Tank investors is Scrub Daddy. It's a little sponge that you wash your dishes with. And so maybe 1 million people think, well, this is neat. It makes my life easier. That's capitalism. That's real capitalism. And then every week when they have the shows on, there's somebody like that. I have an old friend who's a Jewish rabbi. Daniel Lapin is his name, and he's also an economics student. And he gives a great talk. You can see his talks are on YouTube and some of his talks. And one of his lines is related to this. He says, "I would not be surprised to learn that God approves of the fact that we serve each other in business. That the whole thing about being successful in business is to help your fellow human being out, and then they help you out." Okay, that's real capitalism. Okay, another aspect of real capitalism is the famous invisible hand theorem that Adam Smith is associated with. This guy, Adam Smith, who was a Scottish philosopher back in the 18th century. And what the invisible hand is I'll read you, one little snippet from his book. He said, "In civilized society, man stands at all times in need of the cooperation and assistance of great multitudes, while his whole life is scarce sufficient to gain the friendship of a few persons." So in other words, if you think about it, everybody you know in your life, what is it, a few dozen, a few hundred people? But when you buy that Coca-Cola, I see somebody drinking something back there, let's assume it's a Diet Coke or something like that. When you think about it, it does require the cooperation of hundreds or thousands of strangers all over the world to produce that. The way I explain it to my classes, I tell them it would be impossible for all the people in this room to produce a pizza from scratch. No way it could possibly happen. And the students always think, well, sure, I could go to the food line and buy the pizza shell and then some sauce, throw it on there. That's not scratch. Scratch is you need a wheat farm first. You need a wheat farm to grow the wheat, and all the technology, all the mechanics, all the engineering. Then you need the petroleum industry to refine gasoline, from oil, from petroleum, to make all these machinery, the tractors and everything for the wheat farm to work, and to transport the wheat to the place where they turn the wheat into flour. Then you have the flour industry and the tomato industry. So when you think about it, for something as simple as a piece of pizza, you really are relying on the efforts of hundreds or thousands of people who may be from all over the world to give you your pizza or the pencil that you write with or something like that. And why do people do that? Because they all have a desire to pursue their own self-interest, which is another way of saying making a living. They're in it for the money, and there's nothing wrong with that. With being in it for, you're all in it for the money, aren't you? How many of you turned down the pay raise you were ever offered, or expect to? And there's nothing wrong with that if the way you're making money is serving your fellow man, which is what real capitalism is. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. There was no such thing as an economist in the 18th century. And he wrote this book because at the time capitalism was new, relatively new in Europe, and people were wondering, well, is this good or bad for society? And basically what he said, as long as we're within the rule of law and we protect against theft and fraud and force, then the pursuit of self-interest in a market is generally good for society because it promotes the welfare of everybody else. As I said, you can only succeed by pleasing your fellow human beings in some way. And that's basically what the invisible hand is. And capitalism also is a division of labor and knowledge. We all specialize in something. We make money doing that, and then we use that money to buy things for our lives from people who specialize in something else. Just think of what it would be like if you had to make your own clothes and grow your own food and so forth. That's why under capitalism, even the poorest of the poor can survive and do okay because they don't have to have the knowledge to make their own food and make their own clothing. They can go to Walmart or something like that. Because of the International Division of Labor, it makes it much better for even the poorest people in any society to survive. In pre-capitalist times, a lot of these people would have perished from starvation or disease because of the lack of because of poverty was so dire. So extreme. And so it's capitalism that gets us out of that. Another aspect of real capitalism is consumer sovereignty. We see the big bankers and the insurance companies and the Wall Street people. It always seems like they're in charge. You watch CNN or something, and they give the business report. They're always interviewing these fat cats with the $5,000 suits from Wall Street. And they're all big talkers, and they all seem to be in charge. But ultimately, under real capitalism, it's the consumer that's in charge. I was just talking earlier that in my classes, when I make this point, go online and Google image of Microsoft founders. And you'll see a picture of Bill Gates and the other people who founded Microsoft in the late 70s. And it looks like the cast of one of those movies, The Revenge of the Nerds. These little kids, Bill Gates looks 10 years old in this picture. He's the richest man in the world, okay? And so at that time, mighty IBM was the king of the hill in computers. But by the mid-'80s, thanks to Microsoft and Apple and other companies founded by people like this, IBM was losing almost $500 million a day at one point, until they got their act together and became more competitive. And so how did they do that? Well, consumers decided that. They decided they liked personal computers. It's the famous story that IBM was slow in recognizing that people would like personal computers because their business was mostly big mainframe computers. When I was the age of the students in this class, I took computer science. The computer was about the size of a third of this room, big mainframe computer. And you had to type in you did when I took econometrics in statistics. You had to type in your own data on these punch cards, and it was just one step above a stone tablet era back in those days. I did my doctoral dissertation like that, typing all these numbers forever. And you couldn't just buy a data set back in those days. There was no such thing as far as I knew. But so that's a big part of what real capitalism is. It's also a profit and loss system. Profits. My old friend Walter Williams, who teaches at George Mason, where I taught years ago, when he talks about this, he pulls money out of his pocket. He's a pretty wealthy guy, so he's always pulling money out of his pocket. That's a $1 bill there. I'm a professor. And so, anyway, he says he calls it certificates of performance. Because if what profit is in a real capitalist competitive market is a proof that you have served your fellow man in some way by producing a product that they voluntarily gave you the money for. And if you lose money, that means you didn't do a good job of that. That's the system. It's not I keep the profits, you pay for my losses system. That's crony capitalism. That's what all the bailouts were about. And that's why when Bernie Sanders rants and raves against the 1%ers on Wall Street, that's what he's referring to. He's referring to the fact that while they were making money, these people all kept all these multi-million-dollar bonuses every year and so forth. But then when they lost money, they made all these horribly bad business decisions on mortgage loans primarily. Well, that should have been their loss. That's the capitalist system. But the government intervened and socialized those losses. It made the taxpayers pay for those losses. That's crony capitalism. That's a rotten system. That's actually the kind of system that Adam Smith railed against over 200 years ago in the Wealth of Nations. And economists like me I've written 3 or 4 books about this whole thing, criticizing crony capitalism. Okay. The final point I'll make about features of real capitalism is that it's for the masses, production for the masses. Historically, a lot of the things that we take for granted, like refrigerators, cars, when they first come out, they're expensive, and they're only for the rich people. But the way to make really a lot of money is to make it cheap enough that everybody can buy one. Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, became famous for producing cars, mass-producing cars, and selling them for a few $100s, $500, that almost anybody who had a job in his day could afford a car all of a sudden. And they started out that only the richer people could have a car. And the famous Model T, his slogan was, "You can have any color you want as long as it's black." That was Henry Ford in the old days of the car industry. And it's the same with so many other things. And that's why, those of you, a lot of people watch Shark Tank, they always ask these people who are making a pitch, how can we scale this? What they're talking about is that if you have larger scale production, the cost per unit of production goes down. So they're saying, okay, we can sell this thing for $20, and now your cost today is $10. But if we can scale it, maybe we can bring your cost down to $3. That's what they're saying. For those of you who didn't really catch on, you watch the show, but when they use the word scale, that's what they're talking about. They want to sell it to the masses, like Sponge Daddy or whatever it's, Sponge Daddy I think it's called. Is that what it's called? You use that. Okay. So that's what capitalism is and is not. And now, as for let me give you another specific that I hope will stick with you about crony capitalism. A great example of that is the airline industry, the American airline industry. In the 1920s, there was a lot of competition in this new industry, the airline industry, and the government created something called the Civil Aeronautics Board to regulate the airlines. Okay, the Civil Aeronautics Board was captured by the airline industry. There's a whole theory in economics called the capture theory of regulation. And so in other words, the executives of the airline industry were in charge of the Civil Aeronautics Board, and they outlawed price cutting. The government set all the prices. It was illegal for 50 years for any airline to actually set its price. The government set all the prices, and they set them all very, very high, and they outlawed price cutting. Then the airlines resorted to offering free food and alcohol and stuff like that. The government even regulated the size of sandwiches that they could give out on the airplanes because that would be competition. And so that was an example of crony capitalism at its worst. It made monopoly profits for these airlines, and the only people who could afford to fly in those days was pretty much corporate executives whose company was paying the airfare. And then when we deregulated the airlines, another word for that is competition versus monopoly. Well, now I can fly in some times of the year from Baltimore to South Florida for $52 each way, in Southwest or something like that. And we introduced competition, but that was for 50 years. It was so egregious that the people who deregulated the airlines were Senator Ted Kennedy, Ralph Nader, and Jimmy Carter. Those are the three movers and shakers. Three of the most liberal Democrats in the government, or Nader wasn't in the government, but he was a cheerleader. He was totally on board with this because it was such a blatant scam, anti-consumer scam. Okay. Now, as far as socialism, what is socialism? Well, the old definition of socialism was government ownership of the means of production. That was sort of the early 20th century definition of socialism. But that expanded. In today's world, it means that governments take over some industries. But it also now includes the welfare state and the progressive income tax, because the goal of socialism was always income redistribution by the state, by the government. And it also, and I quote the famous book, The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, where he says that, where he says it also, by the time you get to the 1930s, socialism meant income redistribution through the welfare state and the progressive income tax. And then also his mentor, Hayek's mentor, maybe I should write his name down here. I mentioned the name. He's a Nobel Prize winning economist. I don't think he's any relation to Selma Hayek. He's from Austria, Friedrich von Hayek. But one of his teachers was Ludwig von Mises, M-I-S-E-S. In the introduction, I'm associated with the Mises Institute. You can look up their website, mises.org. It's a great source of economic education, all for free. But anyway, Mises wrote a famous book in 1920 called Socialism that predicted that it could never work as a viable economic system. And he was absolutely right about that, as the whole world learned by the late 80s, early 90s. But he said a third definition of it is what he called destructionism, because the advocates of socialism in the world understood that you had to destroy the existing capitalist system first before you could put in its place government control of everything. And so how do you do that? You do it with excessive taxation, excessive government regulation, inflation created by the central bank, which we call the Fed, any means possible. And of course, the never-ending propagandizing against markets and capitalism and the glorification or the praising of government control of the economy. He called that destructionism. So that's what socialism is in today's world. It's not just government ownership of the means of production. And so, what are some of the things you should know about socialism? Well, it can destroy your economic future, because that's been the whole history of socialism. The old Soviet Union, was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. They didn't call themselves the Union of Soviet Communist Republics, because communism was the utopian ideal that they said they hoped to reach someday. But in the meantime, they're all socialists, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And so I'm often asked, people often say to me, well, yeah, that was communism. Wasn't socialism. Well, yes, it was. That's what they called themselves, socialists. The biggest country in the world, 11 time zones, vastly more natural resources than America, bigger population than America. Russia has historically had lots of brilliant people, and scientists and writers and so forth. And by the time we got to the late 1980s, the size of the Soviet economy was no more than 5% of our economy. At the time, our CIA was saying it was 65%. But after the collapse of the Soviet regime, we learned that it was no more than 5%. I have an old friend named Yuri Maltsev, who was an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev. He was actually one of the creators of perestroika, or freeing up Russian society, Soviet society near the end of the collapse. And he defected to the United States, came to this country, and he turned out to be a free market economist like me, because his job for Gorbachev was to read the literature of the capitalist bourgeois exploiters, and he had unique access. He told me that if he was caught, anybody is caught reading one of Hayek's books, there's a 7-year prison sentence to be in possession. But he had unique access, because he was supposed to read these books and then critique them for the government, for the government of the Soviet Union. Well, he's the one who came and convinced our government that the Cold War is pretty much over. Their economy is only 5% of ours. He defected, and he tells me the story that he ends up in Washington, D.C., debriefing Dick Cheney, who was the defense secretary at the time, and he's the one who convinced Cheney that their economy was only about 5%. Yuri tells me that Cheney said, well, our CIA says it's closer to 50%. Maybe it's in between. And Yuri insisted, no, 5%. And so anyway, so that was the Soviet Union. Africa, after colonization in the 1960s, Africa shed the colonial powers that left, and it was a disaster in my view that almost all these African countries, after the colonial empires left, adopted Soviet-style socialism of all things. And they ended up being poorer 40 years later than they were when they started, with being, after the colonists left. And I have an old friend who teaches at American University named George Ayete. He's a native of Ghana, and he's written many books about the history of entrepreneurship in Africa. And he's been making the point for 30 years in these books that there's a long history and a tradition of entrepreneurship and private property in Africa, like everywhere else in the world. And it's a tragedy that so many of these countries did not resort to that, to private property and markets and entrepreneurship. And instead, they thought they could prosper through sort of Soviet-style government planning in the 60s, which was all the rage among academics in the 60s. So it did tremendous damage to Africa, but they are liberalizing, meaning freeing up. In today's world, a lot of the African countries are moved, tremendously away from that, and that's a great thing. The British, after World War II, they ditched Winston Churchill when he ran for prime minister, and elected the Labour Party. And the Labour Party adopted a form of British socialism called Fabian socialism. And they nationalized all the big industries, the steel, the telephone, the coal mines, and the airlines, and so forth. And by the time you get to the 1970s, the whole world was talking about the British disease. The British disease was all these dysfunctional government-run enterprises, which all seemed to run always sort of with the compassion of the IRS and the efficiency of the Department of Motor Vehicles. And so that's how Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of England. It was a revolt against the poverty created by British socialism, Fabian socialism in Britain. And she privatized all of these industries. And that's why Great Britain is much wealthier today than it would have been. England was actually bailed out by the IMF in the 1970s. The British Empire had to be bailed out. Sweden, a lot of the advocates of socialism today point to Sweden as some sort of utopia. But the truth about Sweden is that Sweden was a very low tax, low regulation, high regard for capitalism and entrepreneurship society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It produced these entrepreneurs like Alfred Nobel, who invented dynamite, and the Swedish car industry, Volvo and Saab. Refrigeration technology came from Sweden. And so they had the highest per capita income growth from about 1880 until around 1950. Well, it wasn't the wealthiest country, but the growth was the highest of any country in the world. And then they did what the British did. They adopted their version of socialism by nationalizing a lot of the industries and having very high taxes and a big welfare state. And according to the Swedish Academy of Economics, their association of economists, Sweden did not produce a single net new job from 1955 until 1995. Why 1995? They started cutting taxes, privatizing businesses, including healthcare, and deregulating their industries in the 90s. In other words, moving away from socialism, desocialization. And the head of their government recently very adamantly denied that they're a socialist country anymore, even though Bernie Sanders is out there saying, oh, we want to be like Sweden. Well, as college students, as young students who are going to be in the job market sometime soon. Keep that in mind, that they did that, and there was not one net new job on net created for all that time, 50 years, almost, 40 years. Okay, so that's what happened to Sweden. Another lesson about socialism is you cannot reform socialism. You cannot make it work no matter how smart you are. It's kind of like, we're in North Carolina here. I went to school at Virginia Tech, so I'm very familiar with kudzu. The vine that takes over the planet. Someday the whole planet's going to be covered with kudzu. But I think of, reforming socialism is kind of like trying to reform kudzu. Or if you have kudzu in your yard, well, maybe I'll just clip the edges, a few of the leaves, and that'll work. That'll get rid of the vine. That doesn't work. And there are a number of economic reasons why this is. In other words, it's not just an accident that country after country after country after country for 70, 80, 100 years destroyed its economy by adopting some version of socialism. One is the incentive effect. And the easiest way to explain the incentive effect of socialism is that if this was my class, if you were all students in my economics class, and here's how we would run the class. Have the regular class, I give exams every couple of weeks. You all take the exams and you get your scores. And then at the end of the semester, I add up all the scores, divide by the number of students, and give everybody a C. That would be academic socialism. And so, of course, what you're probably thinking now is, well, why would I study? So if you studied 1 hour a semester, you get a C. If you study 1,000 hours a semester, you also get a C. Well, why work? Why study? And that's the incentive effect of socialism that even the socialists knew. When President Kennedy took Nikita Khrushchev on a tour of Detroit automobile factories, and he said, and he was sort of telling him about the superiority of American capitalism over Russian socialism, Khrushchev was reported in Time magazine as saying, well, sure, everybody knows you can't make an economy work with bad incentives like we have. So he actually said that. So that's one reason. Another reason why socialism never worked is what Hayek called the pretense of knowledge. Because to make the economy work, it relies on making use of all the knowledge that's in the minds of the thousands of people who participate in all the industries. Remember my pizza example. And what socialism is the replacement of all the plans that we make for our lives with some sort of government plan or plans by a few people who think they know better than the rest of us, but who have no possible way of knowing all the information of how to run the dairy industry or how to run the pizza industry or the tomato fields in New Mexico or anything like that. They have no idea, know what they're talking about. And so Hayek called that the denial of the division of labor and knowledge, the pretense of knowledge. That was the title of his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 1974, by the way, the pretense of knowledge. Okay, the third reason is that an economy doesn't work without private property and market-based prices. Prices based on supply and demand reflect scarcity, how scarce things, when things become more scarce, they become more expensive. So it tells you, cut back, don't buy as much. It tells businesses that too. How does the business decide? If you build an automobile, there are something like 16,000 different parts to an automobile. How do you decide which ones to use? There's substitutes for everything. Well, price. You buy the one that's the same quality but the lower price. That's how you decide to build that automobile. And so having an economy without market-based prices is like being in a strange city and trying to make your way around without street signs. How do you know where to go? That's why socialism produced chaos. It's impossible. It would be impossible to calculate profit and loss because there are no profit and loss statements in any meaningful sense if you don't have market-based prices. You have no idea of what people value things. But I taught MBA classes for many years, and I mentioned this subject as part of one of the classes. And I asked them if they could mention, or made the comment, I think, that in all those 70 years of socialism, the Russians never produced one product that was successful in the international marketplace. Maybe caviar, but that comes from a fish, it comes from sturgeon. It doesn't come from a factory. And at the time, I was teaching in a northern suburb of Baltimore, and my university is in Baltimore. And there was a military base there, and some of my students were military officers, and they said AK-47s. They produced, that's the one product they could think of that the Russians produced. But still, we would have no way of knowing that if, I don't know what you would have to pay for an AK-47. Say you paid $1,000 for it. We would have no way of knowing that it didn't cost the Russians $10,000 to make the thing and then sell it for $1,000 because their economy is not based on market prices, based on revealed preferences of the people. So these are the reasons why you can't reform it. You know, country after country after country for decades tried, doesn't work. Democratic socialism can be just as disastrous as under a dictatorship. I mentioned Sweden. It wasn't disastrous, but the latest example of a disaster created by socialism in a democratic country is Venezuela today. Hugo Chavez took power in 1999, and in about 15 years, they totally destroyed their economy. They nationalized all the medium-sized and large companies. They set price controls on just about everything far below what it would take to make a profit in a lot of industries. And they heavily regulated and regimented everything else. And so if you go on the internet today and type in Venezuelan economy, you read stories of how people who used to have good middle-class jobs are rooting through garbage in the streets looking for something to eat. The animals in the zoos are starving to death. They're hunting cats and dogs in the streets to look for food in Venezuela. The government of Venezuela has announced they want to force people to spend 60 days a year working in the farms to avoid a starvation crisis in Venezuela. The International Monetary Fund said that they expect 1,700% inflation next week. I read in the Wall Street Journal that if you went to a McDonald's in Venezuela and you bought French fries, they would cost the equivalent of $350 today for French fries. So it's hyperinflation. And that was created because they destroyed their economy first. The grocery shelves are empty. And then to try to bail themselves out, the government, they print money like crazy. They print money and just spend money that they print, sort of legalized counterfeiting. And that drives the price of everything up. And so it might be even more than 1,700% inflation next year. That's what the International Monetary Fund says this year. And that only took 15 years. 15 years. During the presidential campaign thing, Chris Matthews, what was he on, MSNBC? I forget, one of those NBCs. He interviewed Bernie Sanders, and he asked him, would you care to comment on Venezuela? And Bernie Sanders said no. No comment. He didn't want to bring the subject up. He did democratic socialism. And I don't know, some of you might have seen Bernie on Saturday Night Live with Larry David, the comedian Larry David, who kind of looks like him. They're both, kind of crazy-looking white hair. And Larry David asked him, is there a difference between democratic socialism and non-democratic? And Bernie's answer was always, oh yeah, huge. And Larry David kind of mocked him by saying huge, with like 10 U's in there and huge. But no, not really, not necessarily. If you impose one government plan on the whole population, or you try to, and you put price controls to make it impossible to make a profit as a farmer, and you take over industries that you have no idea how to run them, it doesn't matter whether you were elected or not. Adolf Hitler was elected, for goodness sake. And so, it can and it can't. Democracy can be a good thing to protect us from this sort of thing, but not necessarily, okay? Another aspect of socialism, it does not produce equality. I would argue that the socialist countries of the world are more unequal than the capitalist economies of the world. Under capitalism, you see all these young people on Shark Tank bringing themselves up and making money. You see young people getting jobs. You see all the immigrants coming here penniless and working very hard. I just had my kitchen remodeled by 2 illegal immigrants. One guy's from Mexico, the other's from Colombia, and they came here with nothing. And they did a fabulous, they know how to do everything. They have carpentry, plumbing, electricity, they have their own business, and they're great. And they literally came here with nothing. That's because they took advantage of the American capitalist system. They left socialist Mexico behind. And every time they hear some sort of bad thing that our government does, while they were working. If I left the TV on, they would say, "Sounds like Mexico," to me. But anyway, under socialism, it's always been grossly unequal because the politically connected, the politically elite, always have lived very well. Castro lived like a multi-millionaire his whole life. He had, 7, 8, 10 mansions that he lived in. The wealthiest person in Venezuela today, according to the Wall Street Journal, is the 35-year-old daughter of the late Hugo Chavez, who's reportedly worth $4.2 billion with a B, even though she never ran a business or even had a job, as far as I know. And the journal also said that Chavez's finance minister, who has since left the country, is worth $11.2 billion with a B. The Soviets, the Russian dictators, and the party apparatchiks, they all had numerous houses and they lived great, whereas everybody else lived in equality of misery. That's what socialism does for you, equality of misery, except for the politically connected. Now, Hayek once said, under socialism, the only power worth having is political power. Because in a market system, you can have power by producing a product or a service that other people want. Money gives you power. But under socialism, you can't do that. It's the government is running everything. And they make it difficult or impossible for you to do that. And so it has always produced a more unequal system. That's another reason why I think Bernie Sanders is, I think he's a well-meaning guy. I kind of like when he beats up on the one percenters on Wall Street who didn't deserve those bailouts. But if you go down the route he's suggesting, you'll have a more unequal society. Bernie himself just bought his third home, a $600,000 lakefront house in Vermont. So I guess being a socialist does pay kind of well. Another historical aspect: fascism was a form of socialism. The word Nazi stood for National German Socialist Workers' Party. National Socialism. The German socialists distinguished themselves from the Russian socialists by saying their version of socialism was national, whereas the Russian socialists were international socialists. They wanted to impose socialism on the whole world, whereas the Germans were nationalists, as far as that goes. And so, Mussolini, the same thing. In my book, The Problem of Socialism, I quote Mussolini and Hitler. If you look at you go online, you can type in Nazi Party 1925 platform. It gives what they stood for. And it looks very similar to the Communist Manifesto. There's a famous 10-point planks in the Communist Manifesto that is almost identical to the 25-point platform, minus all the anti-Semitism and things that's in the. But I quote Hitler himself in my book as condemning what he called the Jewish materialistic spirit, so that the Nazis equated the Jews with capitalism. But capitalism was their real target, and it was the Jewish entrepreneurs and business people of Europe that they saw as symbols of the evil capitalism. And so, in Hitler's own words, that's why they did what they did. Okay, and so keep that in mind. Also, keep in mind that socialism. I've always sort of been I don't know whether to be amused or disgusted by this, but I've been a university economics professor for this is my 37th year. I completed my PhD when I was 24. I was pretty young. I didn't like being in school, so I got it over with fast. I worked very hard and got over with fast. And so, anyway, I've always been amused, though, that the socialists on the faculties always take the moral high road. They've got the angels' halos over their head at all times. And I've always been puzzled by that, because their ideology is associated with some of the worst crimes in human history. And if you look under what the socialists of the 20th century have done, as far as that goes, I'll read you some of the statistics. If I haven't put you to sleep by now, I will if I read statistics out of a book. It's almost afternoon nap time anyway. There's a book called The Black Book of Communism, edited by 7 or 8 French scholars, published in English in 1999. Another book by a sociologist named R.J. Rummel is called Death by Government. He's a sociologist at the University of Hawaii for many years. And Rummel, I don't know how you could do a job like this, a career of counting how many people governments killed over the 20th century of their own people. Not in wars, but exterminating their own people because their people dissented against socialism. The USSR, 20 million, China, 60 million, Vietnam, 1 million, North Korea, 2 million, Cambodia, 2 million, Eastern Europe, 1 million, Latin America, 150,000, Africa, 1.7 million, Afghanistan, 1.5 million, on and on and on. And these were dissenters. These were not wartime deaths. These were, my mother's family came from Ukraine in the early 20th century, and Ukraine was once the breadbasket of Europe. But they were 6 million Ukrainians were killed by Stalin, who on purpose, who starved them out, bombed them, set them on fire, did every means possible, because they didn't want the socialists to take over their farms, basically. They resisted socialism. That's what we're talking about. So I've always been puzzled over how so many of these professors can pretend to take the moral high road when they associate themselves with that same ideology of that. I'm not saying that Bernie Sanders would want to do that to us. We have different traditions, and he seems like a nice guy. And he seems like, with politicians, the test I give politicians is, would I have a drink with this guy or invite him to my home for dinner? And he seems like the kind of person I would invite him home for dinner. In fact, a friend of mine who teaches at Ramapo College in New Jersey has contacted Bernie's staff and is trying to set up a debate between me and him at his university in October. So I don't know if it's going to go through or not, but so far he's not said no. So that might be fun. But he seems, so I'm not worried about Bernie sending me to the gulag, and even if he was elected president, I'm not worried about that. However, there is a history of attacks on civil liberties by socialist governments, because what happens is there are these government plans that they say, oh, this is going to make life wonderful, and the plan inevitably fails for the reasons I've given. And politicians never like to admit failure. They always say, well, it failed because we didn't do enough, we didn't spend enough, or we didn't have enough regulations, or we didn't do it the right way. And so they can't take criticism. They can't take criticism. And they can't take competition either. That's why under socialists always have been in favor of highly centralized monopolistic governments where there's no exit. You can't escape. You can't secede from it in any way. Okay, that is, after all, how the Soviet Union imploded, is 11 separate acts of peaceful secession. The Lithuanians and everybody, they just left. And Gorbachev, since they only had 5% of our GDP, Gorbachev basically gave up. I asked my old friend Yuri Maltsev, who worked for Gorbachev when he first came to America, I said, well, why did Gorbachev allow this to happen and all of his predecessors did not? He said he just didn't have the stomach for it, but he also didn't have the money for it. He didn't have the money to do it. And neither did the young people who were in the army at that time. Okay. And so anyway, what socialism always does is there was always a crackdown on free speech and on dissent. And so in the Soviet Union, that meant you were sent to the gulag or prison. But in other socialist countries, it means other types of crackdowns. You see, Turkey today has been arresting college professors or firing college professors. And so the different parts of the world, in today's news, you can read about this sort of censorship of ideas that are opposed to socialism, and in all sorts of ways. And that's what political correctness is all about too, isn't it? In my view, I've been in the academic world for quite a while. It seems to me that it's all about censoring ideas that are not approved by the people who run some of the institutions that are out there. And it's not as horrible as what happened in the 20th century in all these countries, but we're going down that road. And the final thing I guess I'll mention about socialism that you probably aren't familiar with is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union and all of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, the socialist countries, the world discovered that the worst ecological catastrophes that were known were there. There's even a book published called Ecocide in the USSR, because these were closed totalitarian societies, and the government claimed that it was going to protect the environment because there was no profit seeking. You know, we're told that it's the root cause of pollution problems is profit seeking in an unregulated market. So you get rid of profit seeking, you get rid of a lot of these pollution problems. Not true. People from the United Nations went over there, scientists, journalists, all descended on all these former socialist countries, and they found such things as, I wrote one of the things down that's kind of gross. Well, this is not the Soviet Union, I'll say this, but they found things as Lake Baikal, the largest freshwater lake in the world. They found 50 years of untreated sewage had been dumped into it, and there were islands of sewage 8 miles long and 3 miles wide floating around this big lake. Imagine being out on your sailboat on a nice sunny day and falling asleep, and you wake up with a thud and your boat had just bumped into a chunk of sewage 8 miles long. That'd wake you up, I guess, a little bit. In Poland, they had water cannons going through the streets in Krakow to knock down the lead dust and the cadmium dust every day because of the factories. I had a friend that came to this country from former Yugoslavia, and he told me that he worked for the government, so he had a privileged job, and he lived on the 30th floor of a building with no elevator. And I asked him, well, what are you, a mountain climber or an athlete, senior Olympics trainer or something? He said, no, the pollution was so bad that pollution stopped at about floor 25. So if you ever wanted to have your windows open, that's what we had to do. In Poland, if you had lung disease, they sent you to underground uranium mines where you could breathe clean air. Imagine that, uranium mines. And there were stories of people in Poland driving their car down to a river to have lunch, and they washed the car with the river water, they have lunch, and then after lunch the paint had peeled off the car. And just story after story like this. And the reason is, when nobody owns property, people tend to abuse it and overuse it. Where do you see the worst littering problems? It's in the public streets, the public sidewalks. You don't see it, I've been a fisherman my whole life. I grew up in Pennsylvania trout fishing, and so I was always amazed that I walked 2 miles into the woods somewhere, public park land, and look at that, there's a toilet. How did that get here? Or, how did that car get here? People don't dump toilets in cars in their own front yards unless you live in, I don't know, my old neighborhood in Tennessee. They did that when I lived in Chattanooga for a while. But they usually don't do that. They do it in the public spaces. And so the socialist economies were one big commons where nobody owned the property. And so people overused it, they abused it, and they created a horrible, and the government did nothing. Even under democratic socialism, here's something I'll leave you with before lunch. In Venezuela today, there's a gigantic lake called Lake Maracaibo. They dump 10,000 gallons of untreated sewage per hour into Lake Maracaibo. And so democracy is not necessarily going to save you from socialist pollution. And the government of Mexico, by the way, has frequent oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico with their giant nationalized oil industry. And one of the latest ones last year created an oil slick many miles long. It was similar to the explosion that happened by, British Petroleum in the Gulf of Mexico a few years. And so, but the British government claims sovereign immunity. When people complain about it, they just give them a big middle finger and they don't do anything about it. They even denied that it created any pollution until Greenpeace took a satellite picture of it and showed a big oil slick in the Gulf of Mexico from it. And so, on the other hand, British Petroleum, they set up a $20 billion fund immediately, and because they knew they were going to be sued for that, and they're paying out that $20 billion. I think just a couple months ago, the final legal decision came down. And so that's another thing that socialism does. And I think that's my story for today, and I'm sticking to it. But I believe we have some time for questions or brilliant declarations or anything like that you might have. Okay. The young man in the front row has a question.
Right. There are approximately 6 billion people on planet Earth. And Oxfam just wrote a report that said half of the entire planet's wealth is concentrated in the hands of 8 people. Now, when I look at these 8 people, I notice they're not crony capitalists, they're not commies or politicians, they're captains of industry. Capitalists in the truest sense of the word. We have the founder of Microsoft, the founder of Oracle, the founder of Amazon, Mark Zuckerberg, and also the investment guy. Thank you, right? And so these people are capitalists in the truest sense, and the things that they make, I truly value. I love Amazon, I love Facebook, I love Microsoft. And this report also says that half of the world's population lives on $2.50 a day. Yeah. How is a system that leads to this kind of equality good for all?
Well, the system, I disagree that these are all not crony capitalists. Warren Buffett, for example, one of the reasons why there's this controversy over this North Dakota pipeline is that Warren Buffett owns the railroad company that transports petroleum from that part of the world to the rest of the United States. And he, like Zuckerberg and all the other people you mentioned, were big Hillary Clinton supporters. And so that's why she was against the pipeline, because Warren Buffett, who donated zillions of dollars to her party and to her campaign, wanted a monopoly in the transport of petroleum. And I think you could probably make a case that train transportation is probably even more dangerous to the environment than a pipeline is, as far as that goes. And so they're not all real capitalists. And what we've learned from all of history, though, is you could always find poor people in the world. That's true. And what do they need to become unpoor? Is they need more capitalism. These people didn't. Warren Buffett didn't start out as a rich guy. Neither did Bill Gates. Bill Gates dropped out of college after 1 year. And I read a biographical essay about Gates. And as a teenager, his parents lived near the University of Washington in Seattle. He would sneak out of his bedroom when he was 12, 13 years old and break into the computer lab at the University of Washington and write computer code. So that by the time he was 18, this article said he had probably spent 10,000 hours writing computer code. And so he went to Harvard for 1 year after that and got bored and went back to his dad's garage and created Microsoft. And so the real question is, would the world be better off if Bill Gates never existed? Would all these poor people, all the hundreds of thousands of employees that he has created with good paying jobs, would they be better off if he didn't exist? And of course not, of course not. And so these people that made all this money did not take it from anybody. They have created a tremendous reduction in poverty in the world. Bill Gates just gave this school $3 million, didn't he? And so his foundation, the Gates Foundation, just gave Wake Tech $3 million. And so you wouldn't have any of that. And so it's a fallacy. The Oxfam is always coming up with these economic fallacies. I don't know who these people are, but they don't seem to care much about that. The implication is that they got rich by making other people poor. Not true. They became rich and made a lot of other people affluent. They went from poor to affluent. And so I'd like to see more people like Bill Gates in our world, and not fewer. We would all be better off. Young lady, let's get a young lady in here. Hokies, I'm a Virginia Tech graduate.
So, like the idea of the American dream is a capitalist idea, I guess. And a lot of people now are saying that the American dream is dead. What do you think about that?
Her question is about the American dream. A lot of people are saying the American dream is dead. I'd say watch Shark Tank. Yeah, it's always a matter of degree, isn't it? I mean, the American dream being that you can start up a business of your own. And I used to keep in my office. There's a little book called Capitalism for Kids, spelled with a K. Capitalism spelled with a K. It was written by Carl Hess, who was a speechwriter for Barry Goldwater way back when. And it was sort of had some kind of subtitle about how to be your own boss when you grow up. And anybody I knew who had kids 10, 11 years old, and I would give them free copies of this. And I gave it to a friend of mine who's a businesswoman in Baltimore. She owns several printing businesses. She had 2 daughters, they're about 2 years apart. And I gave them this book when they were 10 years old. And I saw the daughter again about a couple years ago at an event at my university. And she came up to me, I hadn't seen her in years. She came up to me and gave me a big hug and thanked me for changing her life, because she decided that's what she's going to do with her career. She's going to go to school, major in business, and wants to be an entrepreneur like her mom. The other one wants to be a lawyer, and so it didn't work with her, but it worked with that. And so, this is just one anecdote, but no, the American dream is not dead. That's why I enjoy the Shark Tank, because I see a lot of these young people with a great idea. Why didn't I think of that? I always say, why didn't I think of that? And they're succeeding, and they're hiring people. There's a video I show to my classes. You can go online and type on YouTube and type in John Stossel greed. And John Stossel used to be the ABC News guy. He did a video 20 years ago called Greed, and there's some great scenes in there of people. There's a guy I know in New York named Steve Mariotti. You can look him up too, and he was a very successful, wealthy businessman. He started teaching in the New York public schools, in some of the worst public schools in terms of the high crime, high poverty area. And he's a huge celebrity in the poorest sections of New York City, because he taught entrepreneurship. He taught these kids entrepreneurship. And you watch this video, and he has these guys. There's this one guy that was in his class and just got the idea, kind of like my Capitalism for Kids book idea. And he's out there in a cart selling hot dogs, but he was making $150,000 a year. So this is a guy from one of the poorest parts of New York City. He's a young guy, and he's making 150. He's out there every day, cold weather, raining. 150 grand a year is not bad. Then there's another guy who runs, in this video, who runs a music business, and he makes $1 million a year. And he says in the video, I owe it all to Steve Mariotti, because he taught us about economics and capitalism and entrepreneurship. And also he taught him a little bit of accounting and sort of the nuts and bolts of how to be in business. And so you don't need an MBA degree to do that. You need the bare basics and a good idea of how to help people. And so the American dream is alive and well. And also with these statistics on income redistribution, they can be tricky, because the U.S. Treasury did a study some years ago, so did the Federal Reserve, where they surveyed people in 1970, late 70s. There's a big database of families, and the government has been tracking these same people all these years, with their permission, of course. And it's a big socioeconomically diverse group of people. And what they found is, for example, so a high percentage, I forget the exact number, but it was something like 70% of the people who were in the lowest quintile of income earners in 1979 had moved up to the first or second quintile by 1990. And so if you look at the statistics on income distribution, as they call it, at any one year, you're always going to see inequality, because human beings are equal. The immigrants, like my kitchen guys, when they first came here, they were a statistic. They made nothing, but they learned the business, and now they're doing very well. I don't know how much money he makes, but I pay him a lot of money to do my kitchen. I know that. And so, cabinets and everything, and they're just great. I've given him 4 more jobs in the neighborhood because they're so good. And so you don't see the mobility in these statistics that you see, but we still do have it. It still exists. Look up. If you really are interested in this, and maybe you can write a paper for a class, the Dallas Federal Reserve Board Annual Report in 1998. If you can remember, that's where this study is mentioned. Since you're a student, I assume you might possibly want to read something like that. Yes, sir, this guy has.
From my understanding, capitalism is not, like real world capitalism, is not self-correcting. You're always going to have the crony capitalism portion developing. You're always going to have do something to recalibrate every so often. Like we saw with Reagan at the beginning of his first term, where he readjusted the American economy. That caused a huge amount of unemployment, but brought down inflation. How do you blunt?
Well, that was the Fed. In the Reagan economy, he mentioned The federal inflation was 13% a year, which is historically pretty darn high. So the Fed under Paul Volcker very dramatically reduced the growth of the money supply, and that's what caused all the jump up in unemployment primarily. But Reagan approved of that.
Yeah. I completely agree that that had to happen. That was a good thing. But how do we blunt? Because it seems like the way that we're currently going is that no politician wants to make the call to create the economic negative in short term to recorrect our current system. How do we blunt that big hit that we're going to take?
Yeah, well, his question is, no politician seems to want to inflict pain on anybody if it's necessary, like Reagan did and Volcker did, if we need pain. Well, that's true. The nature of politics is politicians are all short-sighted because if you're a member of Congress, every election is every 2 years. So if you vote to raise taxes now, for example, and the promise that things will be better in 5 years, you might lose your seat in Congress. So that's the problem. It's just the nature of our democracy. But every once in a while, what seems to happen is the public catches on and realizes through education that something has to be done. It seems like we have to get a crisis, like 13% inflation and 10% unemployment. That's what Reagan came in with before the public says, yeah, we need somebody to, and they trust him. They trusted him to have short-term pain for long-term gain. But I don't know what the answer is other than, we seem to see that periodically where things have to get so bad. And that's not necessarily a feature of capitalism because the things got bad in the 70s because we had price controls on oil and then the Fed tried to inflate us out of the problems they created in the 70s by printing too much money. So it was the Fed that created that problem in the first place. And then Volcker did get us out of it. He's one of the better Fed chairmen, in my opinion anyway, because of doing that. And then of course the Reagan tax cuts were helpful also. At that time, by the way, if you had, say, mom and dad were both lawyers, and they were making a good income, $200,000 a year back in 1980, once they reached that threshold, $200,000 a year, they were in the 70% tax bracket, which meant for every additional $1,000 they made, they owed $700 in tax. And so the top end, the people, professionals like that, just quit working in September because they didn't want to work for minimum wage with all their law degrees and their 30 years experience practicing law. And a lot of them cheated on their taxes or they hired accountants to find legal ways to reduce their taxes. And that was very wasteful to do that. And that's, for those of you who never heard of the story of what was going on. But Reagan reduced the income tax rate for everybody, not just the top. It was then, and that helped too. And Trump is proposing cutting the corporate tax, and all politicians promise middle-class tax cuts, but we'll see. We don't. Okay, another lady somewhere. I don't want to get all the guys in. Okay.
So my question is basically based on the fact that it seems like in capitalism, when there's no regulation whatsoever, you sort of get these kind of like robber baron types where there's like price fixing on the biggest corporations. And then when you try to regulate that, once you give the politicians power to regulate industry, they become kind of the culprits and become kind of involved in the capitalism because they're the ones with power to control the industry. So I guess simply my question is, in your opinion, what's the best way to prevent
His question is that he said under real capitalism, you do have price-fixing conspiracies and things, but then if you put the government in charge of regulating it, you could have capture, like I mentioned earlier, where the industry people who have got a lot of money, they can bribe the politicians to put regulators in that'll fix the regulations for their benefit, not the public. One thing is, you mentioned robber barons. There's a great book called The Myth of the Robber Barons, and some of these people were crony capitalists, but a lot of them weren't. They were just real capitalists, and the historians tend to lump them all together, which is not right and not correct. There are price-fixing conspiracies, but they don't work because cheating always spoils them. They never work for very long at all. And the airline industry, the example that I mentioned, is a good example. The airlines tried to cartelize. They tried to fix prices themselves, but there's always the cheating incentive. If we all agree to charge $1,000 a ticket, and I secretly give rebates so I can get tickets for $900, I'll get all the business. You know, who's going to fly for $1,000 when you can buy a ticket from me for $900? But once I cheat, everybody else is going to say, we better cheat too while the cheating is good, or else DiLorenzo is going to have the whole market out there. So they break down. But then what happens is they run to the government, the same businesses. You know, our private cartel didn't work, so they run to the government and they recruit the government to enforce the cartel by making it a crime to cheat. That's what the Civil Aeronautics Board did. The Interstate Commerce Commission did the same thing for trucking, and on and on. There are lots of examples of that. So I think the best regulator is competition. It's always competition, because there was a famous book that people like me know about this, but there's a famous, well-known left-wing historian named Gabriel Kalko. And you look him up on the web, and they call him a left-wing historian. But I like his book. He wrote a lot of anti-war books that I like, and his book called "The Triumph of Conservatism," and this was about early 20th century America, and he gives chapter and verse of stories like this of how businesses tried to fix prices but failed, so they ran for the government, and that gave us the Food and Drug Administration, which has benefited the big food industries and the pharmaceutical companies. And it gave us the antitrust regulation, which is often used as a bludgeon against competition, and all these other types of regulations. So if you're really interested, that would be one book to look up. I think you can even find it on Google Books online. You don't have to spend any money on it. Triumph of Conservatism is the name of it. I guess we're out of questions. Okay, well, thank you for not falling asleep. A few people.